Welcome to Innovating Clinical Trials, the podcast designed for clinical research professionals eager to deepen their understanding of clinical trials through concise, insightful segments. Join your hosts, Liam Eves and Ted Trafford, as they uncover the core issues in clinical research, reflect on the industry, and challenge conventional wisdom.
So, Nick, this podcast is called Innovating Clinical Trials. And I was just wondering, when it comes to innovation, like what kinds of things are you really excited about in the feasibility and recruitment space?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because whether you think it's exciting or interesting or just plain old
Yeah.
nerve-wracking, it's really the drive to use more data and digital technologies in the space. And feasibility, it's all about data-driven strategies and using data and factual information to form your projections, your strategies, things like that, right? And of course, now more than ever, there's data everywhere, but there's holes in the data, right? And data's expensive and things like that, right? So for example, we have good access to patient data in the US, right? You can have claims data, you can have electronic health records data or medical record data, and different aspects like that. And different companies provide different levels of granularity within that data that you could get access to. But outside the US, it's very hit or miss, mostly miss, right? A lot of it due to privacy laws and things of that nature. So we can't use patient records across the board in a global study. So we have to, if we're going to use patient records in the US, what are we going to use in Europe or Latin America or Asia? And so we have to find ways to fill that gap. Now the technology piece, the good thing is there's a lot of people, there is a better way to do this, right? And a lot of people, whether they're entrepreneurs or other companies, are trying to develop a lot of different types of tools to model enrollment, to improve the site activation process, to this or that. But there's never going to be a perfect tool, especially in regards to enrollment modeling, right? When you think of just enrollment modeling itself, there are so many variables that go into it that you can't account for everything. And so, actually, the more you try to be perfect, the worse off I think your projections are going to be. So there's going to be this limit of acceptance, right? And going back to my last point about we want to be at least 80% confident in our projections. So it's really what it comes down to, Ted, is just being able to weed out, okay, well, what can we use that's going to be effective for us, right? But then one of also the important pieces that I think we're losing in our group within feasibility itself is less reliance on the art of feasibility. Companies want to go fast, furious, data-driven, technology-driven stuff, right? What about the human element of critical thinking and an analysis to say, hey, look, does this piece of data make sense to put into that pot? So we still need to train our feasibility staff in clinical research operations so that they can understand how what they're trying to build can be practically applied in the conduct of the study. So moving towards data and digital and having more efficient ways of creating projections, of selecting sites, of interacting with sites is great and important. But we have to also keep in mind that the best computer in the world are human brains. And even though not everybody knows how to maximize the value in them, we still need to try to utilize them as best we can to make some sensible logic.
I'm so glad you said that, Nick, because there's a great quote, Sherlock Holmes, I think it's something along the lines of there's nothing so deceptive as an obvious fact. And I think that sometimes we use this data in the assumption that it is a fact, when in actual fact it just could be a close proximity. And as you say, is that when you start stringing lots of those obvious facts together, you end up with something that's completely wrong. it also doesn't take into account, which I think was what you were alluding to, like a lot of the human elements as well from a delivery perspective, to say, well, actually, yeah, you can have a ton of data around a site to say this site is going to be absolutely stellar in their delivery. But if you've got a like unmotivated, unproductive personnel at site, then think again. So I'm super glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, I'll give you an example too that just happened this week. I was working with one of my feasibility managers on looking at some data for a projection we were asked to evaluate. We had gotten some information from another group that said, hey, we expect this phase 3 study to enroll at this rate over this number of months, whatever it was, maybe 24 months or so. And so we looked at some benchmark data. We could only find one study that had a similar match in regards to criteria. And it enrolled at a 0.03 patients per site per month. And so when my feasibility manager applied that to our specs, it showed that it would take 6.5 years to enroll this study. This is ridiculous, right? So I looked at the record and I said, oh, okay, here's the problem, right? This record is showing it's a phase 2 study for an oncology indication that's enrolling 396 patients. There are no phase 2 studies that need 396 patients. Now, what does that mean, right? If you have an educated or experienced, better word, experienced feasibility team, they will know that, well, you know what, it probably started out as a phase 2 study. And over time, through amendments, through other things, it became a registrational study. And so the record is not showing that level of detail. But based on experience, you need to be able to pick that out, right? And so by understanding what really is the information behind the data, we were able to deduce, okay, hey, look, this probably had some interim analyses, maybe an enrollment pause, definitely several protocol amendments, right? So let's go back and use a different benchmark study that maybe didn't quite have everything we needed, but we can use publication data to apply to adjust the enrollment rate. And then when we did that, boom, it's
It made
much
sense.
more palatable type of
Yeah.
enrollments.
Nick, I was thinking, for any sites that might be listening, do you have any tips on things that are important for sites to consider when completing feasibility questionnaires that might help them get selected in studies? Or
Yeah, when possible, add comments as to why you're projecting the numbers you're projecting, and also too, and Ted, as I mentioned in that presentation I gave, share information about your site, right? So if provide us with some background information as to why we should select you, right? Especially if there's not an established relationship between the site and the sponsor, right? Give us a packet of information to understand your capabilities, experience, maybe a little blurb on your investigators, just so that we have a higher level of confidence in moving forward with you, right? Ahead of scheduling a pre-study visit.
yeah, no, that's great. Thanks so much.
Nick, what in terms of like you mentioned before around, which I really like, I'm going to steal that, like what's the information behind the data showing? So when you're breaking this down as almost like a mathematical, in my head, I almost see it as like a mathematical equation, right? Where you say, okay, A plus B minus C equals the feasibility. What are the big buckets that you think about when conducting the sort of feasibility to them forecast out?
Yeah, so it's there are several factors that play into the overall enrollment, right? What we do is we look at what the sites are telling us in regards to their individual ability to contribute patients, but then we have to factor in our the time to site activation, or country regulatory approvals, things like that. So when is the earliest we could submit a regulatory package to the EMA? And then from there, how long will it take each country and each site in those countries to get active? Clinical supplies, are there anything related to clinical supply issues or logistics that we need to be aware of? Will study drug be available when we expect at the start of the study? Sometimes it will be for a country or two, but maybe it might be delayed for some other countries, and we have to factor that in. Are there any special supplies that we expect the site to source themselves, whether they're transfer sets, needles, different things of that nature that we want to make sure the site has access to and can source themselves, whether sponsors reimbursing them or not, but we just need to make sure that they're there. And, just it's those are really the main things. It's regulatory logistics, and then and just understanding really the site contributions there.
Yeah. I guess it's like a volume. It's a volume in terms of patient populations for around particular geographic areas, times by the timeline of all the different factors that you mentioned there, like whether it's country startup, site setup, logistics, and so on and so forth. I like that. Let's try and get a mathematical equation where we can wait. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, that'd be nice.